encourage myself with saying, okay, I can't run the world, but I can make choices about the way I consume. And if enough of us make choices that are aligned with values that are important to us, then actually we change the behaviour of the people that supply us with the goods and services that we consume.
God works through his people to effect change, and I think that expectation has been lost in amongst Christians. I think generally we sort of, I think, have adopted maybe a pietistic attitude towards the world, sort of waiting to live out their faith quietly before being translated into heaven. And so I think we should have that expectation and that we can make that change. I think economics helps us to understand, to some extent at least, the narrative around, in two senses. It kind of helps you understand, what's going on. It also helps you to have points of contact where the Christian narrative can show that the narrative designed by economists is not functioning well.
This is the second of two podcasts on Good News to the Poor, a view of Christian economics. So I hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to dchurch.com. So what are the political dynamics currently across the globe on more international level, I suppose, that are interplaying, if that's not too big a question for a one-word answer, where we are now, and what are the forces, the powers and principalities, as it were, that shape the economic direction into the future, economically?
Gee, that's a tough question.
Yeah.
I'm a fairly practical person, so I tend to think about the philosophical tensions that are there, or the academic tensions that are there between competing views of the world, by thinking about contemporary issues. And so, when we wrestle with climate change, we ask ourselves questions about why is it that not everybody's singing from the same song sheet and moving in the same direction. And relatively speaking, we are, but there's obviously, as Amar's highlighted, some examples of countries that have not got the same willingness to move forward quickly. And
so what is that song sheet that's different to one another?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't. The simplistic answer is that governments are responding to short-term political imperatives. That's superficially what's going on here. And in the Australian case, that there is a sense that there is a perception that any move you make to reduce emissions will cost us economically. And there is a narrow view of that which says we'll lose certain jobs in certain industries, such as coal, for example. So that'll cost us economically in particular regions which are reliant on coal mining. But I think even prior to that sort of relatively narrow view, there was a view that it'll cost us economically. This is more the sort of Tony Abbott era. It'll cost us economically, sort of across the board. And in a simplistic sort of argument, there's a bit of logic to that. That if you put restrictions on the market, then that means the market operates less efficiently, and so costs go up, and so welfare decreases. In simple terms, unless those restrictions justified in terms of the long-term benefit they actually bring the world. So making us pay more if we emit carbon is a restriction. It might increase the price of certain things in the short term, because airfares being a good example of that. But the result of that will be less emissions and obviously improvement in relation to climate change, but we don't see the benefit of that for 10, 20 or 50 years. And therefore, a short-sighted government can put that off and worry more about the latest economic growth figures that have come out and boast about those. So I think it's sort of kind of obvious that that's what's going on, but I find it almost maybe there's something else going on at a deeper level, but it kind of I suspect not. I'm not sure that there's a lot of depth to the political strategy that goes on. Right? They think strategically rather than from a short-term point of view, rather than with a sort of long-term vision. And I think that's where we end ourselves in a lot of trouble.
Amar, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I largely agree with that. I'd say in terms of bigger picture trends, over the last 5 to 6 years, perhaps a bit longer, what really stands out is the rise of nationalist populism, obviously embodied by Donald Trump's presidency in the US. You also have the Brexit phenomenon. And the roots to that can be traced to worsening inequality in many high-income countries, and that's accelerated since the global financial crisis. That crisis was partly a cause of that, but there's also other factors, including technology and the linkages between technology and trade. So basically, and here economists are to blame as well, because we haven't, as a profession, taken inequality seriously until now, really. And worsening inequality, I think, has been a driver for these populist reactions, which emphasize national sovereignty, I guess, mainly because there's an association with other countries growing faster, taking jobs, which is not necessarily empirically valid, but that perception is easy to create. And that also manifests in itself in a rejection of the broad consensus that existed globally since the war, that global cooperation was the way to address things and to solve problems that countries faced on the global stage. So if you think of Donald Trump's inaugural speech back in 2017, he said, America would be unashamed in pursuing its own interests. You can argue that every president has actually done that, and Trump was just being upfront about it. But he also added that he invited every other country to do the same, which in a sense is what populism is about. It's a rejection of cooperation and sort of a more kind of narrow focused on a country's own interest, which an economist will tell you is if every country does do that, then everyone ends up being worse off. Because an enlightened form of self-interest would take into account the fact that you need to cooperate to avoid a mad scramble that ends up in sort of beggar thy neighbor policies or attempts to get one over each other. And if every country does that, then everyone's worse off. So I'd say, the upsurge in populism probably stands out, and it's not a left or right phenomenon. In fact, sort of, there's this cliche that sort of runs up the political spectrum is not a spectrum at all, but a circle, and the hard left and the hard right meet at the point of populism. Yes. And I think that's what we've seen over the last decade, and certainly over the last 5 years.
So what might be ways that we can think about in terms of narrowing the gap between the rich and the poor? I mean, obviously, Jesus used the phrase, the poor you will always have with you, and that gets badly misused and misinterpreted out of context. But what might be ways that we can address levels of inequality in the world? Is that just at a level of us as individuals, or is there political and corporate machinery that can help? Is it trying to?
Oh man, that's obviously again another huge question. But maybe
I grew up in the 70s. That's when I first became aware of the IMF, and it became like a bogeyman in British life. The IMF, this and that. Sorry, carry on, Brett.
Yeah. Of course, yeah. So we have these international institutions which are designed to encourage and help us to cooperate, because as Amar pointed out, that's actually how we get everybody better off, when we actually don't just have every country for themselves. And that's a fantastic summary from Amar there, the recent history there of nationalism and economic nationalism that swings the pendulum back towards protectionism and national sovereignty, economic sovereignty, and those kinds of things. And it just creates what makes everybody worse off fundamentally. And it has the opposite effect to what people perceive. How do we get rid of inequality, or how do we create a more equitable or equal world? Is a huge question. But maybe, but I might just offer one thought in sort of the spirit of cooperation. Let's take vaccines from the COVID vaccines that are floating around the world at the moment, and we have countries such as the US and the UK, which have got far more vaccines than they need. And then we've got other countries which desperately need more vaccines, and there's not enough available to them. And way back the middle of 2020, the World Health Organization tried to set up a scheme, or did set up a scheme, where countries could book into a cooperative model. And the vision that they had was that every country would be part of the scheme, that all the production would be pooled, and that would be distributed around the world equally according to need and according to priority. So all the health workers in the world would be vaccinated first, before you then do the elderly, and then before you do the middle-aged and all the other priority groups, so that there would be this sort of vision of a global kind of distribution, which would be equitable. And unfortunately, most of the countries that signed up for that were all the low-income countries, and the rich countries, the US being the leader of the lot, went on a go-it-alone strategy. Said, no, we don't need that. We can look after ourselves. So that is undergoing a little bit of a revival now, that plan, because now we're realising actually it's probably better that we get a few vaccines across to India in their current situation, or even more narrowly speaking, let's take Australia. Let's get some vaccines to Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste, who are right on our doorstep, and who can literally come across here in a boat from Papua New Guinea in particular and bring the virus with them. So actually our future, our safety is actually bound up with theirs. And so it's in our interest to hold back on our needs and to share with them. So that's the starting point of inequality, of producing equality, is to realise that we are actually interconnected as human beings. But it's really only a starting point, because that's sort of built on the idea, well, I'll help P&G because it benefits me. That won't get you very far towards global equality, but it's a start. And obviously we've got to go a bit further than that. So global cooperation, I think, is one of the sort of building blocks, but it's only going to get us so far towards a more equitable world, but it's a pretty good start. Maybe Amar would like to add some other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think first of all is to reiterate the view that inequality matters from a biblical perspective. I mean, I've heard Christians say often that the Bible focuses on poverty and not inequality. That's for me an exercise in sophistry. You can't address one without addressing the other. And it's also fairly clear that the Bible explicitly targets inequality as well, if you look at it very with even a cursory look. I'd say on inequality, first of all, there is some good news in the sense that global inequality fell between the latter part of the first decade of this millennium and the middle part of the second decade, and that's partly because of economic growth in China and India. And reflecting their ability to move, say, from more sort of centrally planned to more sort of market-oriented forms of production. So, to some extent, the fact that you help stimulate growth in poorer countries can help with inequality at a global level. The paradox is that at the same time, you've had worsening inequality within countries, and particularly in high-income countries, inequality is skyrocketed. And so then that creates a whole variety of problems, including the political issues I talked about regarding populism. And there's some sense in which the pandemic can make inequality worse, because what we're seeing is that, people in jobs that are amenable to remote working have largely been able to preserve their livelihoods, while those who are in sectors that are not amenable to remote working and who are not, technologically savvy or connected might fall by the wayside. So in terms of solutions, I think Brett sort of hit on an important point, which is to think about cooperative solutions. I think within countries, what we've also seen is that it's the distribution of capital and the ownership of capital that's driving inequality, and we need to think of mechanisms as to how to address that, and that goes beyond simple taxation. Exactly how you do that is still something economists are grappling with. I think economists have been quite late to the party in thinking about inequality, because the main focus for economists for a long time was growth. But those are, so thinking about the distribution of capital ownership, thinking about how you do distribution via the tax system are, all important challenges at the moment.
This is the end of part 2 of our podcast looking at good news to the poor. Next time we will have the final episode of this podcast, when we will again meet with Amar and Brett and talk some more about what it means to be a Christian in the world of economics and caring for the most vulnerable in our world. Thanks for listening. This is dchurch.com.